44 years ago, a young couple and their daughter, not yet a year old, vanished from a small apartment in Colorado overnight, as if the whole family had been erased without a trace. Police found only their car, abandoned hundreds of miles away, and gradually came to believe the family had left voluntarily. The file quietly sank into oblivion for decades. But behind that silence sat a secret so extreme, almost no one dared imagine it. People are still alive, yet they're robbed of their names, their families, even their own pasts. Then, more than 40 years later, a small wooden object turned up in an old evidence box, and it cracked a case wide open. Before we get into it, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy cold case stories told through investigative files, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Fall 1982 arrived in Aurora, Colorado, with cool evenings and dry winds sweeping down off the Rockies. Just east of Denver, Aurora was a quiet working-class town, full of young families drawn by nearby construction sites and factory jobs. Rows of small rental houses lined the east side streets, kids playing outside until the porch lights clicked on one by one. The Mercer family rented one of those houses a weathered wooden fence, a yard just big enough for their old Chevrolet Malibu. From the outside, they looked like any other young family trying to build something out of nothing. Daniel Mercer was 19, a cabinet maker, hand-scarred from weeks of steady work. His wife Rebecca was 16. Their daughter, Lily Marie, just 11 months old, sat in her high chair most evenings turning over a small wooden ring Daniel had carved for her from a shop scrap of flower shape, with the letter L cut into the wood. On the evening of October 10, 1982, Rebecca mentioned again a cream-colored van that had shown up near the neighborhood twice that week. She had a feeling the people inside were watching the house whenever Daniel was at work. Daniel laughed it off, guessed it was a missionary group. But when he pulled back the curtain, he lingered there a beat too long. Around 7 that evening, Daniel's co-worker, Mark Ellis, stopped by to return a borrowed tape measure, the last person outside the family to see all three of them together. On his way out, he noticed a middle-aged man in a long coat standing near the cream-colored van at the end of the lot. Didn't think much of it at the time. Around 8:40, a neighbor heard Lily crying, then the front door slamming, then a car engine starting in the dark. The next morning, Daniel never showed up to the shop. Rebecca missed her usual Sunday call to her mother-in-law, Eleanor, in Savannah. The apartment manager finally let himself in and found dinner still on the table, Lily's bottle in the sink, a small shoe left under a chair. Coats, Lily's birth certificate, nearly all their clothes still in the house. Only the Malibu was gone. Eleanor demanded the manager report the family missing. Detective Thomas Keller of Aurora PD arrived at the rental on October 11th. The front door showed no forced entry, no struggle, no blood, but nothing about it read as an ordinary evening interrupted normally either. 3 bowls still on the table, a pot of soup gone cold. In the bedroom, Daniel's wallet sat untouched in the nightstand, cash and all. Rebecca's purse sat by the bed, ID, comb, lipstick, her wedding bracelet. 2 packed suitcases under the bed, never opened. Lily's yellow blanket folded in the crib. If they really left, Keller told his crime scene tech, they wouldn't have left all this behind. Out back, a fresh mud trail led from the door to the yard, alongside a shoe print too large to be Daniel's. Samples went to the state lab. Daniel's supervisor confirmed he'd worked hard all day, hadn't asked for time off, and still had a full week's pay, $286, waiting to be collected. Someone planning to run wouldn't ask about overtime, he said. A neighbor, Margaret Collins, recalled that 2 women in long dresses had come by days earlier with bread, calling themselves part of a Christian group helping young families settle in Colorado. Rebecca had taken the bag and shut the door quickly, clearly uncomfortable. The bank confirmed no activity on Daniel's account since the 10th, no withdrawals, no tickets, nothing. Eleanor flew in from Savannah that evening. My son would never leave without calling me, she told Keller. And Lily has an ear infection. She has a follow-up tomorrow. Daniel knows that. Keller classified it as a disappearance under unusual circumstances, no proof of kidnapping, but nothing pointing to a voluntary departure either. Reconstructing the timeline, Keller found Daniel had clocked out at 5:12, Stopped for gas, milk, bread, and cookies at 5:47, the last confirmed sighting of him alone. Rebecca had been seen at a grocery store around 4, paying in small bills, glancing anxiously toward the parking lot. A woman in her 40s in a gray cloak had stood nearby the entire time, bought nothing, and left the second an employee approached her, matching the description of the women who had brought bread to the house days before. That evening, a neighbor heard the phone ring twice. Daniel stepped onto the porch, looked around, and went back inside without a word. A 12-year-old boy 2 doors down, Kevin Howard, told police he'd seen Daniel talking with a gray-haired man beside the van around 7:30. Daniel shaking his head, clearly uncomfortable. Minutes later, Kevin saw Rebecca carry Lily out onto the porch, as if heading for the car, then suddenly turn and go back inside, holding the baby tighter than before. That was the last time anyone saw all 3 of them alive in that house. Based on the evidence, Keller placed the disappearance between 8:40 and 9:10 p.m. No one saw luggage carried to the Malibu. No one could confirm who was actually driving it away. Keller issued a nationwide alert for the dark blue Malibu. Within days, a trucker reported seeing it on I-70 near Grand Junction, trailing a cream-colored van driven, he said, by an older gray-haired man in glasses, with a young woman in back holding something close to her chest. He couldn't be sure it was a baby. Days later, a waitress at a truck stop near the Utah border described a young woman rushing in with a baby, asking to use the phone cut off by an older man in a brown coat shouting, "Rebecca, we have to go right now." She thought it might have been Rebecca Mercer, but couldn't be certain. A gas station attendant outside Moab had jotted down a suspicious plate number on a car he thought might be using fake tags, but by the time Keller got there, the vehicle, along with 2 cream-colored vans, was gone. Locals said a traveling religious group, called Children of the New Dawn, had been camped nearby several old vans, outdoor prayer services, promises of housing and work for struggling young families, and a habit of vanishing the moment police started paying attention. A former member told Keller the group's rule was simple: the fewer traces you leave, the more the Lord protects you. No crime, no fixed address, no membership rolls, nothing to attach a warrant to. After 2 weeks chasing them across state lines, Keller came home with a thicker file and no car. A massive search followed 60 officers, 100 volunteers, K-9 units, a helicopter sweeping the highway corridor. Rebecca Sant, tracked from a nightgown, ran straight to the spot where the Malibu usually parked and stopped dead. That usually means the person left in a vehicle, not on foot, the handler explained. Eleanor gave a press conference, holding up a photo of Daniel carrying Lily. "If someone is holding my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter, please, at least keep the baby safe." More than 200 tips came in. Most led nowhere. One did lead to a motel in Green River, Utah, where a group of 6, including a young couple with a baby who cried continuously, had checked in under fake names, paid cash, and left no trail. In the room, a scrap of paper with a rising sun symbol and the words "A new dawn brings new life," the same emblem former members had described. The group had already left the area by the time police arrived. Again, by early January 1983, the case had gone nearly 3 months cold when Eleanor's phone rang. A woman calling herself Miriam told her, calmly, "You don't need to look for Daniel anymore. He and Rebecca have voluntarily joined our community. They've chosen a new life." She refused to let Eleanor hear her son's voice, insisted Lily was healthy and well cared for, and before hanging up, added that the family could have the Malibu back. Eleanor would just need to cover shipping. Keller organized a discreet surveillance operation for the handoff, set for January 10th at Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama. Eleanor arrived with an undercover officer posing as a relative. 2 vans pulled in, 5 people in matching light brown clothing got out, faces blank. Only Miriam approached, handed over the keys, and refused every request to see Daniel or Lily. "They don't want to see anyone," she said. "You should respect that." The vans left before anyone could follow. The Malibu had been scrubbed clean, no luggage, no car seat, nothing belonging to the family. Only a smudged print and a stray gray thread the lab could never trace. To Keller, the whole handoff reeked of misdirection. To his commanders, it read as confirmation someone had voluntarily returned property on behalf of a family who had chosen to leave. The theory that Daniel and Rebecca had simply walked away from their old life started gaining ground inside the department, and Keller couldn't prove otherwise. What no one in Colorado knew was that 600 miles away in Flagstaff, Arizona, something else had already happened. On December 18, 1982, two women in long gray coats brought a baby girl, not yet a year old, to St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church. The older woman gave her name as Naomi Bell and said the child's mother had dedicated her life to the Lord and could no longer raise her. She refused to let the priest meet the mother, said their group had already left the state, and handed over the baby along with a cloth bag, 2 outfits, a bottle, some diapers, no birth certificate, no records of any kind. The little girl wore a yellow sweater and clutched a small wooden ring flower carved with the letter L. Child welfare took her in. The address Naomi Bell had listed turned out to be vacant land. The phone number had never existed. But in 1982, there was no unified system linking missing child reports across states. Lily Mercer's file in Colorado and this unidentified child's intake in Arizona simply never crossed paths. After months with no one coming forward, a Flagstaff couple, a teacher named Robert Walker and a nurse named Helen Walker, legally adopted her in July 1983 and named her Sarah Ann Walker. Robert kept the little wooden ring in a keepsake box for the rest of his life. Its description flower, letter L, was written by hand into the Arizona file and never once entered into any electronic database. That single administrative gap severed the only thread connecting Lily to her family, and it would take more than 40 years to tie it back together. Through 1983 and 1984, Keller kept chasing children of the New Dawn, but every lead ran into aliases Miriam, Naomi, Silas, with no real names attached. The FBI, lacking clear federal grounds, offered only limited help. By early 1984, with a wave of new violent crime piling up in Aurora, Keller's captain pulled him off the case to focus elsewhere. Belief isn't evidence, the captain told him. An internal review that year concluded it was likely Daniel and Rebecca had voluntarily joined an isolated religious community and cut off contact. Eleanor, hearing this, cold color and tears, Daniel never missed my birthday call. If he wanted to leave, he'd have said one word. That woman never let me hear his voice. That means he wasn't free. It wasn't enough to change anyone's mind. By mid-1984, the file went to open but active status. The media moved on. The posters faded and came down. Nobody knew that, in reality, Daniel and Rebecca had been split apart the very first night at a camp near Moab, Utah. Daniel renamed David Cole and sent to labor in the group's workshops in Utah and later Nevada. Rebecca renamed Ruth Adams and sent to a kitchen crew in New Mexico. Their leader, Silas Creed, told each of them a different lie. Daniel was told Rebecca had left him and Lily had died of illness weeks later. Rebecca was told Daniel had given Lily away and run off with another woman. Neither was allowed a phone call, a letter, or an unsupervised conversation. Each believed the other had betrayed them or was gone. Eleanor never stopped waiting. She kept the family's Savannah landline number for decades, checked it every night, bought a birthday card for Lily every November 14th, and filed it away in a box, not knowing if her granddaughter was even alive. She mapped every western state where she'd sent inquiry letters on the wall of a back room that slowly filled with wedding photos, newspaper clippings, and hundreds of unanswered replies. Keller called occasionally, less often as the years passed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer, still no new leads." She always answered the same way, "Don't close my children's file." He never promised her that, but he never let it go, either. By the late 1990s, the case had moved to Aurora's cold case archive. Keller retired in 1998 after nearly 30 years on the force. Taking one photograph home with him, Daniel, Rebecca, and baby Lily smiling outside their old apartment, and kept it in his home office for the next 2 decades. Meanwhile, Children of the New Dawn was quietly falling apart. Financial fraud investigations in the mid-90s scattered the group into smaller offshoots across Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. Silas Creed vanished before any charges could be filed. Daniel, worn down by years of labor and a head injury from the abduction that had left his memory fractured, escaped a dissolving camp in the early 2000s and drifted between homeless shelters under the name David Cole, believing his wife had left him and his daughter had died as an infant. Rebecca, still living as Ruth Adams, once tried to escape into a police station in Albuquerque around 1988, only for Silas and two others to arrive with forged papers claiming she suffered from a psychiatric disorder and had wandered off from treatment. Without ID, she couldn't convince anyone otherwise and was handed back to her guardians. She finally slipped away for good in 1994 during the group's collapse, but with no documents, no money, and no proof she'd ever been Rebecca Mercer. She stayed hidden under her assumed name for years, terrified that surfacing would bring retaliation against her family. 3 people, 3 names, 3 different states. All 3 certain the family they loved was gone forever. In early 2022, Detective Elena Ramirez, reviewing decades-old missing persons files at Aurora PD, pulled the Mercer case and noticed something everyone before her had glossed over. Children of the New Dawn had returned the Malibu to Eleanor in broad daylight, spoken to her directly, and driven off without ever being identified. They were confident enough to show their faces, Ramirez told her unit. That was a mistake we never fully used. She tracked down Keller, retired but still keeping boxes of his personal notes on the case in a garage office. Together, they flagged 3 details that had haunted him for decades. The cream-colored van shadowing the Malibu near Grand Junction, the gray-haired man watching silently at the Talladega handoff, and Miriam's refusal ever to let Eleanor hear her son's voice. Ramirez got funding to digitize the entire file and cross-reference it against decades of child welfare records across 5 western states. By August 2022, the system flagged a match. Children of the New Dawn had been active near Flagstaff, Arizona. In December 1982, the exact window an unidentified baby girl was surrendered to St. Francis Church. The old intake file listed a wooden ring, flower-carved, letter L, a detail that had never made it into any searchable database. Ramirez tracked the physical evidence box down to a Coconino County archive after weeks of digging and flew it straight to Eleanor Mercer in Savannah. Eleanor held the ring for only seconds before breaking down. Daniel carved this for Lily himself, out of pine at the shop. He put the L on it so she'd always remember her name. There's no other one like it. The adoption trail led to a name, Sarah Ann Walker, 43, living in Tulsa with her husband and 5 kids. Ramirez flew out to meet her in person rather than call ahead. Sarah had always been told she was surrendered by a young mother unable to raise her, never heard the name Lily Mercer in her life. "My parents never lied to me," Sarah said. "They just didn't know the whole story," Ramirez told her gently. Sarah agreed to a DNA test. 3 weeks later, the results were unambiguous, a near-certain match to Eleanor Mercer and to Rebecca's family line. Sarah Ann Walker was Lily Marie Mercer. "So, who was Sarah Walker?" she asked, staring at the report. "Sarah Walker is who you became," Ramirez said, "but you were born Lily Marie Mercer." Finding Lily reopened the far more painful question of where Daniel and Rebecca had gone. Ramirez turned her focus to the woman who had signed the church transfer papers as Naomi Bell and discovered the same face had cycled through 6 different aliases across 3 states over the years. Always abandoned after a short time, none of them tied to stable work or tax history. A former group member named Thomas Briggs, tracked down in Boise, finally talked. Naomi had been one of Silas Creed's closest lieutenants. "If a family looked like they might leave, Naomi took the children first," Briggs said. Silas always said once you take the children, the parents lose the will to fight. Couples were always split apart the first night, sent to separate camps and fed different lies, designed to make each believe the other had betrayed them. "If 2 people still believed in each other," Briggs said, "eventually they'd find their way back. So you make sure they don't believe." That lead pulled up a 1987 farm work roster near Moab, listing a David Cole birth date days off from Daniel's actual one, and a photo showing a small scar on the left eyebrow, matching a childhood bicycle accident from an old family photo. Fingerprints from a Reno Homeless Services intake between 2003 and 2011 matched Daniel's employment prints from 1982 at 12 points. No doubt left. David Cole Daniel Mercer was living at a transitional shelter for elderly homeless adults in Carson City, Nevada. Ramirez and Keller flew out together. In the common room, a gray-haired man sat quietly fixing an old chair. Keller recognized him instantly. Daniel introduced himself only as David, said he had no family left, believed his wife and daughter had died decades earlier. Ramirez placed the wooden ring in front of him. Daniel took it with both shaking hands, traced the carving, and broke down. "I made this for Lily before we moved to Aurora. No one else knew about it." When told Sarah was alive, he could barely speak. Slowly, fragments of that October night came back to him. 2 vans. A gray-haired man telling them to get in the vehicle, Daniel resisting, a blow to the head from behind, Rebecca screaming his name as she and Lily were pulled toward a different van. "When I woke up," he said, "I never saw my wife and child again." It was the first direct account confirming that the Mercer family had been taken by force, not gone by choice, as Silas Creed's people had claimed for 4 decades. Daniel remembered hearing his wife called Ruth by camp cards over the years. That lead eventually surfaced a woman named Ruth Adams at a long-term care facility in Santa Fe, a file with no verifiable history before 1986. A forensic facial comparison found a matching congenital ear fold and birthmark from Rebecca's old wedding photos. NA confirmed it within days. Ruth Adams was Rebecca Mercer. Rebecca described being held near Moab, then shuffled between compounds in Arizona and New Mexico for years. Hard labor, constant supervision, told repeatedly that Daniel had caused Lily's death and abandoned her afterward. She described the failed attempt to get help from Albuquerque police in 1988, turned away because Silas's people had forged records painting her as a mentally ill runaway. She finally slipped free in 1994 and lived in hiding as Ruth Adams ever since, afraid of what might happen if she ever tried to go home. With statements from both Daniel and Rebecca aligning on key details. Investigators secured a warrant for the old property near Moab. What remained of the camp, more than 40 years on, was mostly concrete foundations and a leaning storage shed hiding a semi-buried cellar. Rebecca pointed to it without being asked. "They locked me in there, the first days. Excavation turned up buried rope, a rusted metal trunk full of old license plates and personal items. And wrapped in oilcloth and still legible a black ledger recording aliases, not real names." Cross-referenced against Daniel and Rebecca's memories, 3 entries stood out: David, Ruth, and Little Grace. Beside Little Grace, transferred to suitable family in Arizona. No further contact authorized. Beside David and Ruth, permanent separation approved. Communication prohibited. Dated October 11, 1982, hours after the family vanished. Dina in the cellar matched Daniel. A handkerchief embroidered RM tangled with hair strands matched Rebecca with the words 1082 Ruth written on the wrapping. A separate vehicle log confirmed the Malibu had been driven from Colorado to Moab, then months later scrubbed and shipped to Alabama on Silas's orders, explaining exactly why Keller had found it spotless in 1983. The final pages of the ledger carried Silas Creed's own handwriting: "Child to be separated immediately. Emotional attachment must be eliminated." Signed with his initials, and an order assigning Naomi Bell and Miriam Cross to place the child in Arizona. It was no longer 3 fragmented memories against a wall of silence. It was a documented, physical case. In June 2023, federal agents made simultaneous arrests. Silas Creed, in his 80s, living openly under his real name in Palm Springs, Naomi Bell, under an alias in Tucson, where a hidden safe produced the original church transfer papers and a photo of baby Lily labeled Little Grace, Arizona, October 1982, and Miriam Cross, working as an accountant in Mobile, Alabama, whose personal notebook detailed the exact payment she'd received for the fake vehicle handoff. Silas denied everything. "Did it take you 40 years to find me?" he asked on the way to booking. The trial opened in Denver in early 2024. Daniel and Rebecca both testified. Daniel about the blow to the head and years of forced unpaid labor. Rebecca about having Lily torn from her arms hours after the kidnapping. About the failed escape and forged psychiatric paperwork. About being told for years that her husband had abandoned her. Sarah testified too, describing the shock of learning her whole identity had been built on a lie, one that mattered less to her than knowing her biological parents had spent 4 decades in engineered despair. Her adoptive parents took the stand as well, confirming they'd believed the adoption entirely lawful and had no idea a child had been kidnapped. DNA experts, document examiners, and former members like Thomas Briggs all backed up the same picture. Couples split apart on arrival, documents confiscated. Each person told the other was dead or had betrayed them, a deliberate method for preventing anyone from finding their way back to each other. The defense argued Daniel and Rebecca had lived outside the camps for years without leaving, so it couldn't be called captivity. The prosecutor didn't let that stand. Confinement doesn't require locked doors. Stripped of documents, isolated, beaten, and told for decades you have no family left to return to, that's still captivity. The jury convicted all 3 at differing levels of responsibility. Silas Creed received consecutive life sentences. Naomi Bell and Miriam Cross received lengthy federal terms for kidnapping, forgery, and conspiracy. Before sentencing, the judge told the courtroom that what had been stolen wasn't only 40 years of freedom, it was birthdays, holidays, a daughter's whole childhood. Memories no sentence could ever return. But the law still had to say clearly that it happened and that it would never be excused. After the trial, Daniel and Rebecca were reunited privately at a support center, not a courtroom. Both gray-haired now, both changed by decades apart. There were no dramatic tears at first, just 2 people looking for the faces they remembered, buried under everything time had done to them. Daniel apologized for failing to protect his family that night. Rebecca told him neither of them could have withstood what happened to them. Sarah came in holding the wooden ring. Daniel recognized it before he even looked up at her face and broke down completely. "I remember this ring," he said, before he could bring himself to say her name. Rebecca held her daughter and apologized for never finding her, though she understood now she'd never had the chance. Sarah told her gently that no one needed to apologize. She hadn't lost the parents who raised her. She'd simply found another family that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to remember it. A few days later, Eleanor Mercer, now in her 90s, was brought to Denver. She pressed both hands to her son's face, as though checking it was real, held Rebecca, and held Sarah for a long time, whispering that she'd prayed for this exact day for over 40 years. A photograph was taken before everyone left the center: Eleanor, Daniel, Rebecca, and Sarah, the small wooden ring still in Sarah's hand. The first photo of the whole Mercer family together since the fall of 1982. None of them tried to rebuild the exact life that had been taken. Daniel and Rebecca chose to live near each other in Colorado, close, supportive, grateful for each other's survival, but both understood that the marriage of a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old belonged to a different lifetime. They built something new instead, rooted in the truth they'd finally been given back. Sarah split her time between Colorado and her adoptive family in Oklahoma, telling reporters she didn't have to choose. One family had given her life, the other had raised her, and both were simply hers. The 3 of them later joined support programs for people who had survived long-term identity theft or family separation, sharing what they'd learned about rebuilding a life after losing your own past. Colorado and Arizona began reforming how missing persons and adopted child records were cross-checked between states, a fix that might have found Lily decades sooner, had it existed in 1982. Former members of Children of the New Dawn kept coming forward afterward, raising the disturbing possibility that the Mercer family hadn't been the group's only victims. At the final press conference, retired Detective Thomas Culler stood beside Elena Ramirez and handed Daniel the old photograph he'd kept for over 20 years. The young family, smiling outside their first apartment. "It belongs with you now," he said. Ramirez told reporters the real failure of the original investigation hadn't been a lack of technology, it had been trusting a clean, quiet handoff of a car over the voices of victims no one had thought to look for. "A person's silence," she said, "isn't always a choice. Some people are silenced. Someone can be alive and still be erased from their family, their name, their whole history for 40 years. Finding Sarah didn't undo what Daniel and Rebecca lost. No sentence could return the decades, the birthdays, the childhood no one got to watch. But the investigation gave them back the one thing that had been buried longest, the truth. In the final photograph of the reunited Mercer family, the small wooden ring Daniel carved for his daughter sits beside the new picture, no longer just a keepsake. It's the mark of a child who was renamed, stripped of her past, and still after everything found her way back to it. If you enjoy cold case stories told through investigative files, evidence, and reunions like this one, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case. Thanks for sticking with us through this one. See you next time.